Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today on our webinar. We're going to be discussing the question of will AI-generated text, like what can be generated out of ChatGPT and other related models, kill writing assignments in education? I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Craig Booth, and my name is Jessica Tenuta. I'm Packback's Chief Product Officer. I am not a doctor, but I am very excited to be here today to discuss our experience at Packback and our work with AI in relation to providing instructional feedback to students. I'd love to introduce Dr. Booth, if you could introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background.
Of course. Hi, my name's Craig Booth. I'm Packback's CTO and have been for the past approximately 5 years. Prior to that, I had a career in academia, most recently as a researcher in high-performance computing and astrophysics. And after I changed lives, I moved into the startup space, and since then have been building platforms and working on AI on various applications.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the introduction. And we both, you'll notice something funny about our pictures here. We both included this as a little nod to what we're going to be discussing. Both of these images are actually generated by AI image generation models. So these were trained off of each of our respective faces and generated a new image that didn't previously exist. And I chose this one in particular for mine to show you it did its best at making a Time magazine cover, but you ended up with TTIMEE and some gibberish on the cover there. So we're going to be digging into how exactly these models work and why it might lead to an image like that or text that might have artifacts in it that look really effective, but may not make sense. So we're going to be digging into that in more detail here. But before we get into anything, I want to make sure we don't bury a lead here. We do have a special announcement from Packback about an upcoming feature to help instructors address the implications of these new models and their growth in their classrooms for the spring semester. So starting for spring 2023, so this upcoming January, AI-generated content detection will be available inside of Packback. It will be available in both our discussion platform, Packback Questions, and in our essay platform, Packback Deep Dives. So I included a screenshot of what this will look like, and I'll show an example of a very high-risk case where our model is able to detect with high confidence that a submission likely contains some degree of AI-generated text, with some suggestions for how to then review the text yourself, and an example of what it might look like if a piece of content is low risk. So this will live in the originality report, the same place where plagiarism detection lives in deep dives, and very similarly in Packback Questions in the originality report there. So we're going to just kick off with an overview of what ChatGPT and LLMs, which stands for large language model, what they are, how they work. And our colleague here, Dr. Booth, is going to walk through this in more detail. But just for anyone who might be new to these terms, I wanted to start off with just one visual representation of what exactly we're talking about. So if I right now, prior to ChatGPT and other models like this, wanted to ask a question to Google, and I asked a query of in LaTeX, how do I represent a differential equation? What I'd get back is Google's best attempt at summarizing the most well-ranked response on a website. So it pulls out some relevant text there and shows me those 4 steps. And then underneath that, it shows me, as you've seen a million times, many, sometimes thousands of links underneath with Google's best guess at ranking them by how relevant they are to your query. If I ask the same question to ChatGPT, which is a conversational chatbot that's able to answer me in what sounds like natural language, like I'm talking to a human, I get a different response back. So instead of a list of links that ask me to go do research on those links, what it's going to spit back out to that concrete question is actually a beginning to end explanation of how to represent a differential equation with explanations and code samples. So I chose this example because I think it's a wonderful visualization of some of the stuff that ChatGPT does really well and where it feels really magical. And then we're going to talk also about where are the places where it doesn't do as well later on in this conversation. But I'm going to hand off to Craig to talk us through what is ChatGPT. Craig, can you hear us okay? I will not give as good of an explanation as my colleague, but I will. I'll give my best attempt at explaining this. I know, right, Michael? Yeah, absolutely. He will be back with us just in a moment. But what Dr. Booth is going to be describing here is GPT is a large language model for generating content, and wrapped around it is the chat portion of that. I'm going to hand back off to my colleague here. So Sorry, I started to give the spiel without you here for a moment.
I appreciate it. Technical difficulties. Sorry, everybody. And I didn't hear what Jess just said, so I may repeat a little bit of that. And yeah, in order to really understand what ChatGPT is, and I think this might be repeating precisely what Jess just said, the easiest thing to do is to separate the chat part of this from the GPT part of this. And the way I typically like to picture this is GPT is the core of something, and wrapped around that is a layer of chat. If we could just see the next slide. So for us to keep going, let's just start by just talking about what GPT is. And this slide is going to be absolutely clear as mud. This is probably the most useless slide in this entire presentation, but GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer, which is something called a large language model. So if we go to the next slide, that means the question that I actually want to answer is, what is a large language model? And before worrying about large language models, want to go one step further and ask, what is a language model? So to understand ChatGPT, let's actually boil this all the way down to what is a language model, what is a large language model, what is GPT, what is ChatGPT? So let's start all the way at the bottom of that stack of things. A language model is just a statistical computer program where you feed in a whole bunch of text and it's able to statistically tell you what probably comes next. So let's imagine you feed in the entire text of Wikipedia into one of your models, and it knows, it sees, the followed by cat, and then 50% of the time that's followed by runs. 30% of the time that's followed by sits. So let's just do a very, very quick example. This is a language model. Let's say we give it the text, not all heroes wear. And when it goes and looks at all of the text you uploaded, 80% of the time it knows it says capes, 5% of the time it's pants, 0.01% of the time it's pajamas. So it would guess that the next word is capes, and then just keep repeating that. It knows now that if it sees the text, not all heroes wear capes, it goes to its database and knows 65% of the time that's followed by but, goes back to its database again, looks at not all heroes wear capes, but 40% of the time that's followed by the word some. And then 50% of the time, not all heroes wear capes, but some is followed by do. And then 75% of the time, that's followed by a period. Now, this, I think, is actually really important just to stop and think about for a second. There is, whenever a new piece of technology comes out, it sort of gets shrouded in mysticism. And people hear these big, scary words like GPT. And I think it's really important to understand that the core of GPT is a language model. It is literally just a model that somebody fed a lot of text into. In the case of GPT, it was trained on 500 billion words. So this is basically every page on the internet, the data sets of like books and scientific papers. So if you were training it at 100 words per minute, it would take about 10,000 years of continuous speech. But all somebody did was fed this into a computer model and built something that can, given some text, predict the next word. And that is a language model. The word large in front of it here just means that this was trained on a lot of data. So we're on our way back up the steps that we have to cover. So we now know a large language model is just something that can predict the next word. And GPT is not unique. This is, ChatGPT sort of burst onto the scenes all of a sudden. It was not here a week ago, it's here now. But this is sort of an incremental improvement, and GPT exists. There is also GPT Neo, GPT-J, GPT Neo X, XLNet, BERT, Roberta, Turing NLG, and so on and so on and so on. So there are very, very many large language models, and they're used for a lot of things. And you may ask a very smart question now, which is, if all a language model is something that predicts the next word that's going to be in some text, how does it work? And the answer is that you wrap an application around this. You write some code that knows how to use the language model to do something useful. So these two circles here now look a lot like the two circles on the first slide, where we had GPT in the middle and chat on the outside. This is actually like a general class of things, which is applications built around large language models. And just before we get into sort of ChatGPT itself, let's get a quick flavor of the sorts of things you can get these language models to do by building the right applications around them. You can train them to rewrite things. So given some text, write it in different words, change the tone, something like that. You can train them to summarize, given some text, make it more succinct, maintaining the most important parts. You can extract pieces from text in a coherent way. You can use these large language models to search. You can use them to cluster, find documents that are similar to one another. You can use them to classify. Is this happy or sad text? Is this text about politics or not? And finally, the one that's most important for us, you can use them to generate text. So now let's take this all the way back to the start. Here we are. So GPT is a large language model that is literally just something that, given some text, can tell you the next word. ChatGPT is a chat application wrapped around that. And, well, okay, so that summarizes what I just said. Before I hand over to Jess to talk about really concrete things, I actually, if people are interested, wanted to recommend a paper. This is a paper that appeared on the archive 6 days ago, and I really, if you're interested in large language models, recommend giving it a read. It's titled Talking About Large Language Models. It contains probably the most succinct summary of how these things work, which is really, when you're talking to ChatGPT, you are only asking it one question over and over again, which is the bit that I underlined on the right. Given the statistical distribution of words in the vast public corpus of English text, what words are most likely to follow the sequence ... And that is literally all they're doing. Again, I really want to underline, there is no magic happening here. There is no magician hiding behind a curtain. ChatGPT is a language model that just looks at the statistics of language and asks, what's next? And before I hand over to Jess, just one last large language learning model thought, and this is from the same paper. Interacting with a contemporary LLM-based conversational agent can create a compelling illusion of being in the presence of a thinking creature like ourselves. Yet in their very nature, such systems are fundamentally not like ourselves. The shared form of life that underlies mutual understanding and trust among humans is absent, and I like this bit. These systems can be as inscrutable as a result, presenting a patchwork of less than human with superhuman capacities, of uncannily human-like with peculiarly inhuman behaviors. And I think that is what Jess is going to dive into right now.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go through a couple of examples to illustrate how this tool works. You may have been seeing examples already floating around Twitter and around the internet. Certainly discussions around this are happening very real time across industries. So education is certainly one area where people are really asking, how does this impact our classrooms? But businesses are asking as well. Designers are asking in relation to the image generation models we were talking about earlier. So there's quite a lot of chatter happening on the internet right now, and they're oftentimes highlighting the most incredible magic feeling examples. So it's really important to dig into, with practical, realistic assignments, how does this system perform? So I actually took a couple of examples from our platform deep dives, real prompts that were used in classrooms this year. So the first one, and these are not my words, these are again grabbed as an example of a prompt that was given to students. So the prompt here was discuss the main themes in chapter 7 of Harvey and Fine. They cited a textbook from their class. What family theories can you apply to the themes of hope, despair, family chaos, missing parents? Apply at least one theory to 2 of the themes we discussed in this chapter. This chapter is in the module Uncoupling, Relationship Deterioration, and Divorce. So I fed in just this exact text into ChatGPT. This is what I got back out. And it's a very interesting response. You'll be shocked, as I think I was, and many people have been, in the quality of the coherence of the text that comes back out. It's very convincing. It sounds like a real person to an extent. It certainly is grammatically correct. But when you start looking closer, what you'll start to notice is that to an expert, to someone who is experienced in this field, some things start to stand out as being a little unusual. So the first big thing is, this is not what this chapter is about. You can actually look up and find the Harvey and Fine textbook, look at chapter 7. It is about a completely different topic than hope, despair, family chaos. It's digging into specifically divorce and the implications of divorce. It does not cover these topics in depth. So this is not the theme of this chapter. And you'll also notice down here, references in the last chapter, various family science theories. These theories provide insight. These can be applied to this, right? So what I notice when I look at this is it's actually very similar to a student who might be writing in very coherent text, but doesn't really know the material or hasn't read the textbook, right? So they're saying, I can, this chapter can be understood and explained through various family science theories, as going back to the prompt, as we asked it to do, right? Apply 2 of these theories to the themes discussed in the chapter. It's saying we can apply various theories, but it's not saying what those theories are or how they apply. So to me, this one is a great example of, it's very much like someone who can write very well and coherently, but hasn't learned the material. So I wanted to just ping Craig for a word on kind of his color on what's happening here based on what he just explained on how these models work.
Yeah, so everything you see here is completely unsurprising if the large language model is just something that was trained on all of the text on the internet to predict what word comes next. And it happens not to have any knowledge of what's inside of any of these individual papers. Therefore, where you ask for specifics, all it can do is return very generic things.
Yeah, thank you. And I grabbed another example from Deep Dives. This is from a class on immunology, and this class looked at lab reports and research proposals. So basically writing authentic looking research proposals as if you were going out for grant funding to fund your project. And I took first just the exact text from the prompt. So this text, you'll notice, includes things like the learning goals of this project, right? And some other language in here that makes it clear that this is an academic assignment. So if I pass in just this text with no changes, what I get back out is really an explanation of the assignment, right? Paragraph 3 here, in terms of organization, the long document should be structured in a clear and logical manner, right? So this is really describing what this language model expects the structure of this assignment to be, but not actually answering the question. So this is a good example of what you put in is directly relevant to the quality of what you get back out of the system to an extreme, right? Very similar to if you've ever tried to Google an answer to a question you were looking for, and you phrase it in one way, you get out content that does not really answer the question you were looking for. But if you rewrite the question, you make your query better, you might get out a much better set of search results that help you answer your question. So again, just underscoring that what you put in is directly relevant to what you get back out in quality. So I took that same prompt and I rewrote it as if I was talking to ChatGPT, asking it to design me a proposal to answer this question. So again, I underscore it should be in the space of immunology. It should be a realistic proposal for an authentic problem in immunology. Asked it to cite sources from several credible sources to make the case for why this project should move forward. So let's see what it does in this case. It does spit back out something that looks much more like a realistic research proposal, right? So it's now in introduction format. It provides rationale. It continued on to break down kind of the schedule of steps that it would recommend for this project. This one did repeatedly cause the system to keep failing. Actually, it would get through about 6 paragraphs and then I get a network error and it would clear. So there's no intention to not show the whole thing. I just actually couldn't ever get it to keep the full answer on the screen for me. But you can see this is much closer to what a real research proposal would look like. But again, when you start looking closer, this was actually from a class of someone who I think is joining us for the webinar today. So I don't want to call anybody's name out, but if this assignment looks like it's your assignment, if you want to add to the chat as an expert in this field, if anything seems off to you, what I noticed when I was looking through this is this ChatGPT answer is proposing an assignment, or is proposing a research study investigating the role of IL-10, a cytokine, and immune intolerance in autoimmune diseases. To me, who is not an immunology expert, this looks very believable at first glance. Like, wow, this is fascinating. It generated a novel experiment that needs to be run. When you look closely, it says the role of this cytokine IL-10 is not well understood. So I wanted to question that. Is it really not well understood? I did some external research outside of ChatGPT, and it very much is well understood. There is extensive research on the role that this molecule plays in our immune system. So again, looks like an authentic problem, phrased like a research proposal, but the contents don't make a lot of sense if you are an expert in this field. Interestingly, so just keep in mind here, it said in the last paragraph, however, the mechanisms by which IL-10 regulates immune tolerance and contributes to the development of the immune system, immune diseases, is not well understood. Let's ask ChatGPT what it thinks about that question. So I asked it, how does IL-10 function in the immune system? And I get back out a much more concrete answer because I passed in a concrete question. So it's now, as Craig has been describing, it's using statistical probability, looking at the data set that it has to make a projection on what words follow one another in providing an explanation on this, right? So where the prior answer provided context saying this is not well understood, now if you pass in that direct question, it gives you a directly contradictory answer. And I asked then specifically, is the function of IL-10 in the immune system well understood? Now it gives me a directly contradictory answer to what it gave before. Yes, the function of IL-10 in the immune system is well understood, contradicting what it said earlier that it is not. So that's fascinating. Let's keep digging into this further. And I'm going to try a high school advanced English essay prompt, a very generic prompt that is oftentimes used, I think, in college admissions essays and other AP level classes for English practice. So you'll notice it's a fairly open-ended prompt. It has been said, not everything that is learned is contained in books. Compare and contrast knowledge gained from experience with knowledge gained from books. In your opinion, which is more important? If I pass in that, I get back out a 3-paragraph essay that does exactly what was just asked, compare and contrast. You'll notice that it is not making a strong opinion statement in here. It is continuously going back and forth and saying, on the other hand, but on the other hand, and providing the pros and cons of each. So I took this and I asked it, that seems fairly generic what you responded there. It's not giving a strong opinion. It obviously reads very much like generic average text, which again, back to how these models work, they are very much optimizing towards the average, if you will. It's making the most likely projection of what comes next. The style of writing on a default, if you pass in a basic prompt with no modifiers, is going to come out sounding very much like this, a very direct response. But if I ask it to expand on this and include more metaphors, you start to get something that sounds a little bit more like a real student or a real person, right? It's now included a metaphor saying, one way to think about the difference is like thinking about a journey. When we gain knowledge from experience, it's like embarking on a journey and learning from sights and sounds. But knowledge learned from books is more like having a map that guides us on our journey. It's actually a pretty dang good metaphor for this. Very interesting. But this is a fairly high school level response in terms of its depth. So I asked it, rewrite this at a college level, include 2 academic journal citations using in-text citations. And this is where things get very interesting. So it rewrote it. It did increase the reading level of the response. And you'll notice a couple of in-text citations here, Jones 2017 and Smith 2019, referenced several times throughout here. So it gave me my 2 in-text citations that I wanted. But I can't see yet what those citations are. So I asked it to tell me, what are those citations? I'm just calling them out here, these 2 different authors in different years. So I asked it, can you provide the full citation for those in-text citations that you used in the prior answer, including the title of the relevant article? And it said, sure, here are the full citations for the article I used in the previous response. Jones A, 2017, The Value of Knowledge Gained from Books, Journal of Education, 121 to 132. Anything look a little strange about that? Right? The next one is The Limitations of Knowledge Gained from Experience, right? These are not real articles. These are fully invented sources that follow the appropriate syntax for what a citation would look like. The system has enough training data to be able to make a projection on what does an academic journal article typically look like in its formatting, what might be an appropriate title based on the context that I passed in, saying I'm asking you to provide a response in relation to book knowledge versus experiential knowledge. It gave me a convincing title based on the context I passed in the expected format based on being trained on many, many, many citations from the internet. But these are not real people. These are not real journals. These are not real articles. I just want to pass back over this. This to me, I think is a really, really important point to drive home. There is no knowledge behind the scenes within this model. And I think Craig can underscore that even more strongly.
Yeah, when Jess first showed me this example, I was reading it and then something really jumped out at me. If I were a machine that just chose statistically the most likely next word to appear, and I knew that I had to put a citation somewhere. I knew the next thing, I should end this sentence with a citation. That's what other things do. I'll put in an open parentheses. Then I know I need a name. And it's important to ask what name is most likely. And if you look at what it chose, Smith and Jones. It just went and picked some of the most common possible names, because statistically, if you have a citation, it's highly likely to be a Smith or a Jones.
Yeah. Yeah. So I thought this was just a shocking moment to be able to underscore the output, revealing the underside of how these models actually work. And we'll dig in now to the implications of what these models are good for, what they're not great for, and how they relate to classrooms. But I want to actually show a tweet from the founder of ChatGPT. So this is the founder of OpenAI, which is the company that made ChatGPT. And he is self-admitting here, this is an amazing innovation in technology with good and bad that comes with any innovation. But he's self-admitting here, there are some things that this model is not great at, specifically anything that relies on external knowledge. So he's saying, for reliance on factual queries, not such a good idea. So it's something to think about when, I have anticipation that some companies may try to use this platform just exactly as it is and try to roll it out as a tutor to students. It is dangerously correct, if that makes sense. It is correct often enough that releasing it to students without protections in place and without the appropriate level of control on the system could be very dangerous, because it will state incorrect knowledge with a degree of confidence that makes it seem very realistic. So back to the quote that Craig shared earlier, a very convincing illusion. So what kind of prompts does it do well with? I'm going to move through these quickly. Things that it's good at: explain a common and well-documented concept concisely to me. So something that is talked about extensively on the internet. It has enough examples of that to have been able to train an effective projection of what should come next. So explain a large language model. It does a great job at that. It does a good job at generating new content that's being put into a structured syntax like HTML. So if I say, I passed in this prompt on the left here, write me the HTML for a simple single page application with these heading levels about this kind of company, fill in a paragraph text under each one. So if I understand enough to be able to communicate to it and say, this is what I want, it can do a decent job at populating things in a structured syntax. And when you really think about it, grammar is a structured syntax as well, which is why it does such a great job at generating believable and readable content. But the content of that may be very factually inaccurate. So again, it's doing a good job following a structured syntax like grammar. It's just not doing a good job of having the content be accurate in all cases. Teach me why you generated that structured code the way you did. I think this is potentially one of the most powerful applications of it when it's correct. And that's like a big asterisk I put on everything here. To be able to explain to a student the steps to follow a process to get to structured syntactical output. So this is really cool to be able to say a very junior web developer might be able to interact with this tool to help explain. And just as a reminder, ChatGPT is not creating this content. They are based off of training models, like training data, like what can be found on GitHub, which is not so different than what engineers already do. They're just going out and doing the search to get to that answer themselves, and having to wade through and use human knowledge to say what is correct, what is incorrect. Here, what happens is statistical likelihood is determining what's going to appear in this chunk of text. So the less documented something is, the more likely you might get an unexpected result back out of the system. And then respond to a prompt if the prompt contains a high level of detail. So I grabbed this one from the AP history exam. This includes a lot of keywords that the system can key off of to help to provide a response. Things like the years that we're referencing, British colonies in the Chesapeake region, British colonies in New England. Those are all things that can be used to pass in to get more effective projected next responses from the AI. So that's something it does well at. If you asked it to expand on or analyze this content, it will do much more poorly. So I'm going to just show all of this on this text on this slide here so that Craig can talk through this, but I just want to talk through the strength of these models to help get our wheels turning on how these might be used to help students. And then we'll also dig in and just summarize the weaknesses of these models that you can use in your classrooms to think about how potentially to adapt and evolve current assignments to put a much higher threshold of students using these models in a dishonest way. So if you want to take it away, Craig, on strengths and weaknesses of these models.
Yeah, I feel like I have little to add to the strengths slide. Jess just covered each of these things. When something is concrete and when there is enough keying in the question that a probabilistic model can figure out a good answer, these models are very, very strong. And sort of the title of this webinar is about, is the essay dead? I think there are very, very many uses for tools like ChatGPT that are unrelated to essays, just learning to explain things, learning to summarize things, etc. But that's the things it's good at. Let's talk through the weaknesses in a little bit more detail. And the first is, if you set a prompt for some students and they all just go and paste this prompt into ChatGPT, you're going to get something that looks very similar. Maybe a few words will get chosen differently, but same information in, same information out in each case. And it won't do anything original or novel. By definition, from the way this thing is built, it requires other people to have said similar things repeatedly on the internet for it to be able to reproduce that. So it will do very, very average things and is not good at originality or novelness. They also sound very, very confident at all times. And this was baked deep into Jess's examples. It would invent people, invent theories, invent references, and there is no way to tell what is real and what is not. It just assumes it's accurate all the time because all it's doing is statistically what people have written in the past. And then, I want to dig into this a little bit later on, but if you imagine the Bloom's taxonomy triangle very quickly, so working up, remembering, understanding, and applying, this type of model is really, really strong at. They fall over currently very quickly when you ask them to analyze, evaluate, or create genuinely new things.
Yeah. And so I hope we wanted to just give context on what these models are, how they work, show some examples of them looking very convincing, but on further analysis, really having the contents of what they're writing be invented or be incorrect. So what I wanted to have the takeaway of the first half of this webinar be is this is a truly an amazing step forward. We're seeing a Cambrian explosion of applications of generative AI right now. It's really exciting and interesting, and it really represents kind of a step forward in technology that can only really liken to the experience of seeing the internet become widely used, right? With all of the good and bad, upside, downside, and implications on education that had with it. But I want the takeaway of this to be, this is not a replacement for a human writer. And on examination from an expert, you will see that many of the things that the students are many of the things that is being generated out of the system can be seen by an expert at a quick glance that it is not accurate or not authentic. So back to our original kind of clickbaity, I hope you'll forgive us, title of this webinar, is the writing assignment dead as a result of this? Strongly feel that it is not. And I'm going to talk through what educators can do in relation to what's happening with these models in your classroom to be better prepared to, one, talk to your students about them, modify your assignments to be a little bit more well defended against the easiest applications of using this for academic dishonest purposes. And then what we're actually going to, I think the most interesting part of this conversation is talking about the future a little bit of what kinds of new assignments and new doors might this open up in classrooms. So we'll dig into recommendations for instructors now. And I'm going to talk about three things. One, incorporating tools that help instructors detect cheating and reinforce necessary skills in students. This is really getting to the point of using technology for detection and instructional support to help you figure out what's happening in your classroom, and then also tools that help to instruct students as opposed to using tools that just simply generate content for them. Transparently, we are a company that works in this space. I'm going to talk about how we can help educators. But 2 and 3 here is looking at how can we provide some ideas for how to modify existing assignments that don't take much work to make a change. We're coming up close to the spring semester. We're very aware of that. So our recommendations here are intended to be incremental, tiny changes that will make these models much harder to use for cheating in a classroom. And then 3, talk about experimenting with new assignment possibilities that can assume or even require the use of ChatGPT and other LLMs in the student's workflow. So what would happen in assignments if we just assume that students are using these tools? How would we build an assignment around that? So I'm going to talk first about how Packback and tools like Packback can help. Specifically, the first piece being And I know it seems crazy to fight fire with fire, right? Fight AI with AI, but it's actually one of the most powerful ways to use the same model in reverse to help detect when students may be using these tools. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, plagiarism detection is available in Packback Questions, will be available in Packback Deep Dives for the spring, alongside AI-generated content risk. And what you'll see is a risk label, as well as a confidence rating on how likely is it that this piece of submission contains some degree of AI-generated text. The way that we're approaching this is hopefully to empower instructors to have the knowledge and information about what's happening in their class and make it really easy to see at a glance where they might need to dig in more deeply on a student's work. If I saw this in this case and I saw AI-generated content risk high, my next step would be go to their references and check the citations that they included. Are these real citations? Something that Packback also does that I'll talk about in just a moment is automatically checking the validity of citations and checking the credibility of those citations against a number of factors. So I saw, I'm forgetting who said it now because I have to scroll back up a little bit, but saw someone mention my grading time just doubled. Monica said this in context of seeing now we have to check every single citation because they could be very convincing fake citations. This tool, Packback, can help with that in that when you are looking at the student's submission, being able to see the quality of their citations and did they resolve to real citations and were they marked as credible based on the type of citation that they used. So hopefully we can be supportive on that side, as well as the detection of just, in a raw sense, was there AI generated content being used here? So detection and alerting is one key piece of how tech can help. The other piece I wanted to talk about is instructional AI versus generative AI. I think that this is a moment in time where it could be easy to paint AI, because it's a kind of a scary term, with a broad brush around this is bad for students, right? I think it's very important to differentiate between generative AI, which might be writing content based on a prompt, and instructional AI, which can actually explain what is happening in a student's text. So the way that Packback uses AI in our system does not ever generate content for the students. It is always reading their content, analyzing what they've written, and then providing step-by-step or line-by-line or rule-by-rule feedback with explanation for why they received the feedback that they did and how they can improve upon it. So this feature here that you're seeing, this we call this smart highlighting. I have the narrative voice rule expanded right now. This is actually new in our system as of about 2 weeks ago. So students now can see algorithm by algorithm by algorithm, which again is very different than what the ChatGPT model does, which is pure statistical probability around language. Our system is rule by rule based to be able to provide specific feedback on how students can learn how to improve around that portion of their writing. So where ChatGPT, if you said, write me a paper in third person, would generate text in third person, this is showing students where do they have inconsistencies in their text and explaining why it's important to use consistent narrative voice. And you could do the same thing for any of the other rules in here and see in the text exactly where we are making a reference with the feedback they're providing. So this to me gets to the heart of where I think EdTech should go in response to these models, which is how do we reduce the benefits of cheating, right? How do we reduce the incentive? If we're providing students upfront with actionable feedback that helps them get their best possible score and teaches them in the process of getting that, get into that positive end goal, the benefit of this is on the process as opposed to just the outcome. So how can we give students feedback along the way that makes them get to their best possible score through the work that they did, as opposed to a student who might feel inclined to use ChatGPT because they're not a strong writer and they just need to get the grade, right? If we're leading with the feedback to help them get that strong grade, I know that there's the benefit also of time savings, right? But that's helped to be mitigated by this prior one of in those cases where a student is really trying to be malicious. Can we catch those cases and bring them to this instructor's attention? But for the vast majority of students, and I can even speak to the students that are on our platform right now, oftentimes when a student plagiarizes, one, they don't even know that they did it. They don't necessarily know what's the appropriate way to cite text and how to make sure that they are not plagiarizing. And sometimes it's just not malicious in its intent. So if we pull feedback forward, how do we reduce the incentive for cheating by helping them reach their best possible score, specifically tied to the instructor's rubric, which is also different than ChatGPT. So the notion of instructional AI tools versus generative AI tools, it's sort of fighting in the reverse way of helping students build up as opposed to feeding in a prompt and getting a unexplainable chunk of text back out. The third thing I want to talk about is a focus on research and process through a scaffolded UX. So we've actually introduced intentional points of friction into the student's process, if you will. So instead of just everything being all in one gigantic document, which is sort of the way that these chat models work, we've broken up the experience of generating research, writing your draft, and citing your references into separate portions. So all of these, if you needed to then complete this while working with a chat model, it would be a great deal of work on the student's front to be able to break up what they're asking into all these different steps. We've made it easier in here for them to not cheat, right? You can paste in your link, you get feedback immediately as a student on the quality of your citations. This is a screenshot, but if you expand this and you click see why, you see a detailed breakdown of why Wikipedia was cited as potentially credible, but a book might be cited as highly credible. So that's all rule-based in our system and breaks down almost like a checklist for students to show exactly how they can evaluate a source on their own. So all this just to underscore the goal of teaching students how to learn as opposed to generating things on behalf of them, right? Like ChatGPT does. So this system also, to Monica's earlier point, your ability as an instructor to be able to, at a quick glance, see, are these DOIs resolving? What do they resolve to? What is the quality of the journal that was cited here? How often has it been cited? That level of detail on what we use to calculate the student's recommended score around credibility of their sources also dramatically helps to reduce grading time. So sales pitch over. I hope you don't mind us talking about Packback a bit. Our focus here is really asking right now, I think there are tools in our system that can help instructors be ready for the spring. So I want to make sure everybody is aware of those in context of this bigger question about how do we adapt our assignments for the spring. So again, on a few-week timeline, what are the smallest things that we can do to better prepare our classes for spring and beyond? And then we'll talk about the longer-term timeline in just a moment. So first thing I want to talk through are a few ideas around modifying existing assignments. So as you saw throughout this conversation, it really struggles with research because these models are not connected to the internet. They are not searching the web. They're just generating the next plausible piece of text in the appropriate structure based on their training. So incorporating the ask for citations in your assignments whenever possible will dramatically ask students to do their own work as opposed to using these models. So incorporate research components whenever possible. I saw this idea, bullet point 2, suggested in the chat. Trying new mediums is an interesting way to think about adapting new assignments. So if you have a written exam that's a take-home test and it's long-form writing and it's close-ended questions, right? That might be one of the more dangerous things for this model, right? If they have open book at home, ability to search the web, ability to work on their own time scale, and they're being asked to answer more close-ended knowledge-based questions, that is a dangerous way that these models could be used. So thinking about, can you reframe some of your take-home writing exams over into new types of mediums like a video or a verbal presentation? And that also enriches different skills like presentation. I'm most excited about this recommendation on number 3 of asking students to explain their process. So as you saw, the system generates a final product without a lot of knowledge, without knowledge and without logic for how it reached that conclusion, to be able to break that down and explain it. Asking students to explain their process of how they made the conclusions they did. How did they reach the points they wanted to make? What did they research along the way? And submit a process document alongside their essay may also be a way to really help to detect, did a student write this work on their own outside of just the automated method of identifying that. This bullet point 3 here, I think, is mostly focused around if a student is asked to explain their process, their incentive, again, to use a model like this goes dramatically down because they're going to need to do a heck of a lot more work to show their work if they use ChatGPT than if they wrote it themselves. So next 2 suggestions, referencing readings or lectures as the basis for a writing assignment without including the text of those items in your prompt is also a really powerful way to add a layer of protection against these models. So if I reference, as you saw earlier, if I reference the textbook and I say, go to chapter 7 or build on what we just discussed in the lecture, the model does not have knowledge of that. The student would have to do significant work to teach the model or give the model sufficient context to have the answer make any sense in context of what you're asking them to do. So referencing readings and lectures as the basis for writing assignments can be very helpful. And as Craig mentioned earlier, considering swapping lower level Bloom's prompts, so things asking students to explain, for higher level Bloom's prompts focused on evaluation, analysis, and new idea generation. So things that are asking students to generate novelness will be much harder to cheat using these systems. So I'll pause there and just underscore any points. If there are any questions about any of these, I want to make sure we have time to dig into the modifying existing assignments portion. And then what I'm going to move into is some future-facing or futurism-focused ideas around what might the world look like in the future, and how can we build assignments that align with what that world will look like, in the same way that in 100 years ago, when we were teaching math, we did not have calculators. We were being asked to do calculations by hand. Math classes look different now. So how do we build assignments for the future world that we're heading into? So any questions on modifying existing assignments or other ideas if people want to drop in the chat? And I'll just hang here for a moment in case we want to have any discussion. Awesome. Yes, I encourage people, if you have ideas that you're thinking about for your classes in the spring that you want to share with peers, we've got a lot of people in this webinar. So if you want to, be kind and share the things you're thinking about to help combat these tools in your classroom and prepare your students with good context about these. The one kind of final point I will underscore on this is I do think, as scary as it feels to talk about this to students, because it makes them maybe aware of something that you might think that they might not be aware of right now. Again, this is making the rounds on the internet at the moment. I do think it's a very good idea to lead with talking to your students about these tools and talking about why it is so important to write their own content. What are they going to get out of the assignment? What skill are they gaining? Why is this important? All the same stuff that I know that all the instructors that are here with us in the chat already do. But I know at this moment, when we're seeing a big technological revolution, it may seem like we need other answers, but sometimes going back to those basics of just strong instruction and helping students understand the point behind the assignment may really help in these cases. So if they feel that there's no downside to using these models and they don't know if they're gaining benefit from the assignment, that's where we have interesting problems happen. So being able to reinforce the value of the assignment, I think, is a really important conversation to have. Yeah, good question. It depends on what you, responding to the question on can it create questions? It can, to an extent, create whatever you're asking it to. The quality of those things is dramatically different based on the quality of the prompt that you're passing in. So the more context you pass in, the more parameters you pass in, the better the text that you get back out is. I showed a couple examples of, generating code, for example. It can generate open-ended text, right? It can also generate games if you want it to, right? You can give it, these are the parameters for a game I want you to design, and it will spit back out in those parameters, in that syntax, a structured game. So it can kind of respond to whatever the quality of the prompt is that you're passing in, which actually is a great transition into thinking about the future. So just some suggestions for net new assignment types that assume the presence and assume the use of ChatGPT and other related models for students in the future. So one suggestion is find the right question. If you create an assignment where the product of the assignment is asking students to create the most effective query to get the best possible output from the AI. So for example, if you make an assignment saying, write me the best possible query to get an effective and accurate essay back out from ChatGPT around these topics, asking them to document their process. I showed you an example of mine where I start with one question, I saw what came back out, I tuned it, I tweaked it, I asked for follow-up questions to get to a better result at the back end. Asking students to document the interstitial steps of how they reached a good result could be a very interesting net new assignment type. Similarly, be the reviewer. As I've shown a few examples here, and there are myriad examples of this model making up fake theories and giving incorrect answers. One really very concrete and funny one was you ask it, what's the fastest ocean mammal? And it spits back out a bird first, and then it spits back out a fish first, because it's looking at when you think of when articles on the internet have written about fastest animals in the ocean, they're oftentimes referencing the bird first and then the fish second. It doesn't have an understanding of or an awareness of what a mammal is in that context and how to define it. So being able to take a complete essay that you've provided to your student that contains inaccuracies, and then ask the students to edit the essay. So imagine they're a peer reviewer, and they've gotten this submission from one of their peers, identify, document, and correct the inaccuracies, and then provide feedback back to the person who submitted. Could be a really interesting assignment. Outline building, similarly, as I showed, this model can only generate short chunks of text at a time before it kind of falls over. So asking a student to, instead of generating a final paper, think about the intro, the paragraph points they'd want to include in an essay, the conclusions, and the detailed support for each of those. So instead of focusing just on the grammatically correct output, how did they reach that output by breaking it down into an outline and providing the support? And I think the most maybe exciting option here is the last one, which is a reverse research paper. I think this builds two skills. Giving the students a conclusion or an argument which lacks all defense, right? So it doesn't have any research associated with it or references or defense, and ask them to build up the references page that would have defended that conclusion. So I think this also stretches the muscle of, regardless of what they believe in their opinion about a topic, provide them with a conclusion, ask them to go through the exercise of how would I defend this if I believe this. I think that's a really interesting output, which outside of just figuring out how to work around or work with these chat systems also teaches, again, a very different skill set that's going to be very valuable in this new world, which again is a great transition to the last few things I wanted to cover here, which is looking ahead. What does the future of the world, the future of work, and the future of education look like in context of these tools? So I'm going to hand off to Craig. I want to have him give a little bit of color on this chart that you're seeing here. And then I've got a couple questions for him as our machine learning expert on the team and as a machine learning expert more generally outside of Packback to extrapolate what he thinks is coming in the world. So if you want to take us away, Craig.
Awesome. Thanks, Jess. Before I do that, there was a question asked by Leslie a few minutes ago that I don't want to miss. And that question was, would AI be smart enough to make a response different for students from the same college so that a professor would be less likely to notice similarities? And so both yes and no is the answer to that. I could say, write an essay. I could then ask it to write the same essay in the style of Hunter S. Thompson or in the style of Stephen King or anyone else, and they would look different. So in that way, yes, the AI can be coached to write things that look different. But at the same time, it is a simple statistical model under the hood. And we are rolling out detection of AI content on Packback in the near future. And the way that works is by looking for the statistical fingerprint of these models. You know, the way they're trained, the word "the" follows the word "if," well, approximately 0% of the time. But there is a strong fingerprint in these things that can be used to identify things. So even if it looks different to a human, it is entirely possible to spot that things were machine generated. So with that aside, this chart I thought was super interesting, and this really tells you sort of what's going on in the world right now. So this is the time it took various companies to reach 1 million users, measured in months. So Netflix took about 3.5 years to go from 0 users to 1 million users. Twitter took pretty much dead on 2 years. Facebook took 10 months. Instagram took 6 months. ChatGPT was announced, you know, it's strange that we're sitting here doing a webinar on something that probably nobody in this room, myself included, had heard of 3 weeks ago. ChatGPT went from 0 to 1 million users in a matter of days. And my interpretation of this chart is, you know, the research has been sort of progressing linearly. You know, large language models are not necessarily a new thing. People have been building them since at least 2018 might be the first one I would call large. What has happened is that overnight somebody put out an application that makes things usable. And the world was ready and excited for that. So there was very much a world before ChatGPT a few weeks ago, and there is a world after ChatGPT now.
And I think that's a great segue into the question I wanted to ask you of how do you project that these models will impact the future of work?
That's a great question, and I just said, you know, the cat is out of the bag. This is not something that we can reverse at this point. 3 weeks ago, nobody knew that it was possible to generate reasonably convincing content from a prompt. Today, very many people know that it is possible to generate reasonably convincing content from a prompt. What does that mean? It means the baseline has just changed. The ability to generate content is now something that everybody can do with very little effort. And when I stop and think about how that makes me feel, it's scary and exciting at the same time. And I think that's just the nature of things changing. The example I keep going back to with this stuff is, imagine being an accountant in 1970, and you're happily tallying up numbers on a piece of paper, and then spreadsheets come out. And all of a sudden, everything that you used to do is now being done by a machine. And what happens next? Well, it's not that there are fewer accountants in the world. It's that the nature of the work just changed. And again, if we sort of collectively picture Bloom's taxonomy, the pyramid that we draw, what it's doing is shifting the work that humans are doing from the bottom half of that pyramid, remembering, understanding, and applying, up into the top half, which is typically what students struggle with, the analyzing, the evaluating, and the creating. So I think at like the grossest level, what this is going to do is take some of the work that human beings have to do when it comes to just remembering, writing down, understanding, applying in simple cases, and shift the humans up to the top level of Bloom's taxonomy.
Great point. And I think that taking that same answer and thinking about how does that relate to what educators can be doing right now, forward-thinking educators in particular, thinking about 2, 3, 4 years out, how can we prepare students to succeed in that vision of the world?
Yeah, that's there's actually Joshua just wrote something I think that's interesting and relevant and scary. Where is it? That just scrolled off my screen. Given the exponential rate of improvements to these GPT systems, many of these tips seem to be exploiting vanishing vulnerabilities. Isn't it likely that these will be corrected in future iterations of the tech? And I think in part, yes. I think my big takeaway here is, and I remember, God, this has been true for probably a decade at this point, but the strongest chess players in the entire world are not humans, and they're not machines. It is when a human and a machine collaborate to produce the best possible outcome. And I think, you know, the world we're going to have to shift to thinking about is one where we collaborate with AIs. And, you know, I, by nature, am a software engineer. A lot of the work I do in software engineering, honestly, is I Google the right answer for things. And then I copy paste code and I edit and curate and review and fix. And I think that's what's going to be happening to work in general. And that is going to be the core skill set that people need. It's going to shift away from apply, understand, remember, up to having the ability to curate and the ability to edit, the ability to verify, and the ability to do research. And potentially, you know, any one of the concrete suggestions that Jess made might be something that a malicious owner of a large language model tries to defeat. But I think, you know, philosophically, the direction we need to be thinking is, how do we embrace this technology? Pandora's box has been opened. It's not going away. How do we embrace it and work with it, and move into, I don't know who said, the augmented age. Dan, to everyone, move into the augmented age where we assume that we are being assisted by AI in the high value work that we do.
Yeah, excellent conclusions. There's been some really interesting chat happening. Kevin just asked a question or made a point on, will the top level of Bloom's ring hollow if the students don't have that strong level of underlying competencies? And I think just to reinforce back what we talked about earlier in the conversation, these models are not magicians. They do not have a smart robot behind the scenes thinking about what should happen or having knowledge of subject matter. So even in these simple examples that I showed here, it is a requisite that the people that are using these models has a level of expertise in the subject to be able to discern true from false. Because again, these are not knowledge generating models. These are text generating models that follow a semantic structure. So while I agree, and that's part of why we included this graph showing how quickly this is growing, we do need to be thinking, you know, for the future 5 years out. But I also want to keep underscoring these models are not magic, and the underlying technology that's being built on is not magic. It is statistics. So someone will still need to have knowledge to be able to discern right from wrong, true from false, accurate from inaccurate. And it's true at the simple text, simple concepts, and also very true in expertise, like that is specific to subject matter areas. So I saw one great example of a researcher playing with these models as well in her subject matter. So a PhD researcher in a subject asking for the system to comment on or research or do a lot of the same things that I did in this example here. And to even someone who has a lower degree of expertise but is experienced in her space, it generated text that looks convincing, but when you truly know the subject matter, you can parse out that it is generating stuff that looks convincing but is false. And again, it's back to this is just a statistical model under the hood. And Joshua, great points that you made. I do want to just make sure I clarify one thing. The way that we're rolling out detection is not actually looking at if the citations are real. That's purely on the student side to be able to give students feedback on how to research, teaching them the skill of researching. The actual detection alerting feature that I've been talking about is actually based on using these statistical models in reverse. So in the same way that these systems generate content on the basis of statistics, you can use that same type of model in reverse to generate a report looking at the markers of how likely something was to have been generated with one of these tools. So it's much more that as those models improve, the counter models also improve. If that gives people a little bit of reassurance, that's the way we're approaching detecting AI plagiarism, is looking at using the models against the models, right? Fighting fire with fire. So I want to turn it over to questions now. If folks have questions that I may have missed earlier up in the chat, we've been very much in the slides. So please use the Q&A box if you'd like to ask any questions. I know we're at 1, so if you'd like to drop off, please feel free to do so. Craig and I will hang out for another 10 minutes. We'll stay until 1:10 to be able to answer questions that folks have and provide any follow-ups. But I just want to first close out by saying you can either email myself or Craig with any questions you have about how the product works or about other recommendations on how to adapt your classroom to this new emerging tech. My email is jessica@packback.co. Craig's is craig@packback.co. And if you're interested in trying out Packback and our instructional AI as opposed to generative AI with our detection tools, you can speak to a member of our team by emailing curious@packback.co. So again, we'll hang out for a few minutes. Feel free to drop questions in the chat. And thank you all so much for being here today. It is an exciting time in history. I'm really excited for the potential of what this can do for education and for the future. Very, very excited about all the people that joined and showed interest in this conversation. So thank you for being here today. And again, we'll hang out here. If you have any questions, please drop in the chat. But otherwise, we'll just hang out. We're going to play the outro music here for us. So thank you all so much for being here today. Thanks, Leslie. Good to see you.
So if there's one thing that just scrolled by that really resonated with me from Dan, my only parens deeply philosophical question is, how is human language fundamentally different than GPT, especially in the context of learning? And this has honestly been on my mind a lot recently. What comes out of my mouth now may not be 100% coherent or pre-planned, but hopefully interesting. And I think that any time you interact with one of these models, we use words like think and know with computers all the time. And, you know, I might say, yeah, the computer knows that's not right. And that is a reasonably benign thing to say. But now that large language models exist, it feels like we need to be more careful with the language that we use, because these things can appear so human-like that people will begin to anthropomorphize them. So, you know, the language model knows this or understands this. And that's why the first half of this webinar was really like me bashing on, these things are not magic. They are only answering one question, which is, what is statistically the most likely next word, over and over again? When a human being asks me a question, I first of all know it was asked by another human being. I know roughly what things they know. I know that when I answer, that is going to probably change some knowledge that's in their heads. And I don't necessarily have a neat conclusion here, but it's a fundamentally different thing. It's a empty piece of statistics versus the connection between two human beings. And I think I've taken far too much time to talk about something that perhaps should have been talked about in the bar.
No, I love it. And we were talking the other day about, we didn't talk much in this conversation about image generation, but all the same ethical questions and panic and excitement is happening in the art world right now as it relates to generating images. And it does get to the core of asking, you know, what is uniquely human, and is something generated by the AI generated by a robot, or is it a reflection of and an amalgamation of all of human knowledge up to that point? It's a really fascinating question. It's one of those things that, you know, I was telling Craig when I was a kid and I was thinking about the future, my background's in art before my work with Packback, thinking the one space that could never be automated, right? I was thinking this in the 90s is art, right? Art is too foundationally human. And now you're seeing some beautiful work being created by these systems. And I like to, now this is purely more of a philosophical answer, but I like to look at that with a bit of optimism to say, these models have been trained on the entire breadth of what humans have created. And this is just holding up a mirror to the best and the most beautiful things that humanity can create. And I know that that's not related to how do we make this work in our classrooms and how do we prevent cheating, but on a slightly positive and optimistic note, it's kind of beautiful to see that this model was looking at the entirety of what we have ever generated as humanity and what can those models be used to create then. And I've been seeing some really exciting things that artists are doing to collaborate with AI to create net new artwork that wouldn't have been possible before at a much faster and broader scale. So it's opening up whole worlds of individual artists generating an entire comic book or generating an entire screenplay, show, set, etc. So it's very fascinating. And I saw a couple questions I want to address. Marguerite asked, how would I go about assigning writing to a class of 150 students if I have to check all the citations? Not to be glib, but that actually is exactly what Packback is for. It's how deep dives works. What you'll end up seeing when you're going into grade is a recommended score for the quality of the citations, which takes into account only citations that we can resolve and the credibility of those citations on the basis of how well cited was that journal, how well referenced is that journal, the journal impact score. So how broadly reliable is that journal, as well as the number of citations? Is it an academic journal? Were we able to resolve this to a certain kind of website that may be more reliable than others, like a government website versus a social media website? So it actually gets you down to a single recommended score that does those calculations for you, and then you can dig into why it gave that score too. So it's, again, pulling kind of like the easiest table up to the top. And then if you want to dig into it, if you see risk factors, you can see more detail by digging in further. So I'm very excited about the way that this can help in these classes. And I don't think it's relevant just for the spring. It's looking at the difference between generating text without knowledge and teaching students the skills to fish on their own, right? Being able to teach them how to research and how to write line by line in an instructional capacity. So I do very much hope that it's helpful for folks this spring. So yeah, I'm going to scroll back up and see if there are any other questions. And April, yeah, thank you for your point. Yeah, it is fascinating to see, and artists are reacting in kind of one of two ways, either very, very nervous or very excited about the potential that this opens up. We keep saying it, but the cat's sort of out of the bag. I do think it's something that even if we are each not excited about these tools, it is important that we all learn about their capabilities and limitations and learn how to collaborate with them, because someone else will. We want to make sure that we are up to snuff on what the kind of state of these tools are, because it does impact our field, kind of whether we like it or not. And I'm just scrolling up. Yeah, great point, Carrie Ann. Thank you for adding that. Yep, there are many websites that can help solve math equations. That has not eliminated the need for math homework or for math assignments in classrooms. And then how do you ask a student to write an argument and then tell if a weak response is generated by the computer, or if a beginner student just isn't adequately trained to speak at the level of Bloom's? I think that there's some things we can do here, Leah, are follow-up questions or those process documentation of asking, how did you reach the conclusion that you reached? So even without changing the basis of your assignment, you could potentially think about adding just a component of also please submit your rationale for how you reached that, or your process for how you reached that. And I think that to Craig's point of being able to, when a human asks a question to a human, all of the calculations that we do mentally to decide what is the answer we want to give is very different than the single path of calculations that these statistical models do. So being able to have a human document their process tells us a lot more than just the output of either an AI generated piece of text or even a human generated piece of text. The process is really, I think, the new product. Wonderful. Yeah, I'm just checking to see. Yes, and Kevin, we have. So Deep Dives is an essay platform for students. So it's a learning platform for essays. You can host lab reports, business case studies, full-blown research papers on there. And it has a wide variety of actually more complicated feedback that it gives to students, again, around quality of sources. It generates their citations for them based on the citations that they can resolve in our system. So if they put in a DOI, we'll build their citation for them and then show them what's missing in the citation, teach them how to cite in the proper format. So again, very much all with the goal of teaching students how to fish. And all of that feedback is tied to your specific rubric. So if you customize it, you can make your rubric the exact basis for the feedback that they're receiving, as opposed to generalized Packback feedback. So I hope that that's helpful. And if you want to take a look at it, I'm happy to talk to you, or I know a member of our team would be happy to show you how it works. It is a little bit different than our discussion platform, but share some of the underlying tool set to be able to give students real-time feedback. So thank you both so much for the questions. Thanks everybody for being here today. If there's any, if there's one last question, we can wrap up with a final question here, but I appreciate all the comments and I'm glad that the session seems like it's been helpful. Oh, here we go. We got one from my team member, Lane, who bumped it. Isn't it logical to assume that as we change our prompts, then won't they eventually get fed into the machine and they too will be able to be generated by ChatGPT? Great question. And again, this gets back to is there underlying knowledge in these models? So tweaking the prompts does not change what's being fed into these large language models in terms of the ability for these models to understand what they're saying. So yeah, I don't know, Craig, if you want to expand upon that. I mean, it's still back to that same question of how do these work under the hood? And it's just a projection of the most likely language to follow each word. So if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, it's these things are only as powerful as the data that you feed into them. So if your questions are specific and not simply available in some big data set, the model will struggle as long as that data is not fed into the public internet at some point. And in terms of scale, the number of essays that are written every semester is absolutely dwarfed by the volume of the internet. So the presence of a handful of essays on the internet is not something that is going to meaningfully change the model in a very real way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, great response. And I think that's a great question for us to kind of wrap up on, of asking what makes these models better and what keeps these models the same and just allows them to be used. I just want to respond to Tim Hill's question that my teammate Lane just shared. I just want to be clear, yes, the AI detection will apply to both our online discussion platform, and that will apply with the auto moderation process that we currently do for plagiarism, for profanity, for close-ended questions, all the things we already do. This will be a new rule alongside that there, and you'll be able to see the output of that score by looking at check plagiarism on each post. So you can click the plagiarism report and see the results on the online discussion board, and it will also apply to deep dives as well. And similarly, the result there will show on the plagiarism report or the originality report, where instructors can see, is there a flag that this text may have been generated by AI? And if so, how do you want to respond to that as an instructor, with some steps that you can take to further analyze, is this student written text or AI written text in those cases where it may be more ambiguous, right? Not the 98% sure that it's AI written or 1% sure that it's not. We'll give you some steps on how do you analyze a piece of text that might be a little bit more ambiguous. And yep, April, absolutely, they will be notified if they are flagged. On the discussion side, it'll be a high threshold of certainty to flag and notify students. And then if they do get moderated, they get a coaching email by email. And instructors, if you would like to be able to see all the record of flags and moderation, you can be added into a beta that we're showing right now for you to be able to see those results. So you just let our team know if you'd like to see the full report, and you can see the report of all the interactions of flags and moderation and then republishing that students have done. So yep, just to be very concrete, April dropped a question in the chat asking if students will be flagged and notified on discussion. If they are flagged for this reason, they will, if it is a high degree of certainty, and then they get moderated. So perfect. Yeah, April, we can get that added for you. I'm not sure who your team member is that you work with, but if you just send them a note, they can get you added into that beta. So yeah, I think we'll wrap up there for today. There's so much more we could talk about. I'm very excited to keep the conversation going. So please do email us if you have questions or just want to chat. Thank you all so much for being here today. And I hope that our spring semester, embraces some of these new technologies, and I hope Packback can support y'all through this change. So thank you all.
Thank you for spending a lunchtime with us, everyone.
Take care.